It never ends with quadruple murder suspect Bryan Kohberger, does it? Never ends. In the last days, his attorneys are challenging DNA evidence produced by the state, claiming that DNA from 3 other men were found at the crime scene. We understand that there is DNA from 2 males, not Kohberger, inside the home on King Road, and DNA evidence, male DNA found on a glove found outside the home. I recall seeing a practically frozen mitten in the snow outside the home. I don't think that that had anything to do with the murders themselves. But this is going to be an attack on the state's case, and it will probably turn into an attack on the victims themselves. Joining me right now, Chris McDonough, star of The Interview Room on YouTube, also director at Cold Case Foundation. You can find him at coldcasefoundation.org. But for today, his relevance is because he has investigated over 300 homicide cases. We have the attack on the state's DNA evidence. We have other attacks ongoing, claiming that the police, LA law enforcement, had tunnel vision on Kohberger, thereby shutting out investigation of any other potential suspect. And we also have, now rising to the forefront, a prior criminal arrest by Kohberger. Up until now, we have been told that he was lily white, pure as a nun. But now we're learning that's not entirely true. You know what? Before we hit the DNA attack, let me go to Chris McDonough joining me. Chris, the reality is that he is not the saint the defense has painted him out to be. What do you make of his prior arrest?
Well, Nancy, I mean, thank you for having me. I'm so grateful. You know, it just goes into what we've been talking about as we've discussed Bryan Kohberger. We're going to start seeing information that will provide itself into the public arena about his previous behaviors and his previous interests. And obviously now that this has come forward, you know, we had the image initially of this young man, you know, who was struggling through school, wanted to become a police cadet, yet now this arrest, you know, surfaces, and you start thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, maybe he wasn't as pristine as the defense has, you know, been presenting him through the motions. I think it's fascinating that the defense has gone on, you know, the offense here by utilizing verbiage such as, you know, these reports that contain exculpatory information. I mean, you as a, you know, a trial attorney, a very successful prosecutor, what sticks out to you? I mean, when we start seeing this type of stuff, you know, present itself.
Are you talking about the prior arrest, or are you talking about the DNA challenge?
Both.
Well, with the DNA challenge, I would expect it. I mean, now that we know other male DNA is at the scene, of course they're going to challenge it. But what matters to me in that vein is, where was the DNA found? Was it found on one of the murder victims? If that, it's highly incriminating toward that other male. Or was it found on the coffee pot downstairs? Was it found on the door handle? Was it found on a light switch? That means nothing, as opposed to Kohberger's DNA found on the sheath of the murder weapon in the bed with Maddie Mogan. That's damning. So that's one thing. The other DNA attack is on the process of how the DNA comparison was made. Number one, there's nothing at all out of order with the DNA testing. It was done pursuant to lab regimen. So that challenge is going to fail. The defense is also challenging the state trying to keep Kohberger's family tree private, so members of his family are not pilloried by the press and others. But there are two DNA matches in this case. Number one, when Kohberger was followed from all the way from WSU, where he was a PhD student, home for Thanksgiving with his family in Poconos, the police watched the home. They obtained abandoned DNA at the time. That abandoned DNA was from Kohberger's father. It was matched to the DNA at the crime scene on the knife sheath. And that DNA match proved, with a huge statistical number, that the donor of the DNA on the murder weapon knife sheath had to be the biological son of Bryan Kohberger's father. Had to be. And Kohberger's father only had one biological son. So you've got that DNA match. Then they take the DNA, now that they figured out it's him, and they build a genealogical tree. And they now trace the DNA on the sheath directly to Kohberger from a buccal swab. DNA taken from his saliva, from his mouth. So what I'm saying is there's two DNA tests damning him. They're not going to win on the DNA challenge. I'm very, very curious about this prior arrest. Now, we know the prior arrest was back in 2014 for stealing his sister's cell phone. And it was Kohberger's own father, Michael Kohberger, that turned him in. He called police and said that Bryan Kohberger had been struggling with drugs, we believe heroin. He had a drug addiction. He had just gotten out of rehab and rejoined the family. And one of the first things he did when he got back in with the family is steal his sister's phone. Now, according to documents, he paid a friend $20 to take him to a mall where he sells his sister's iPhone worth $400 for $200. What? For more drugs? For what? Why was he stealing a phone and selling it behind his parents' back, stealing from his sister? He's arrested, he's charged with theft, and he took advantage of a first offender program. And I've granted it myself to first offenders, where if you complete your probation or a course or your community service hours, and it's your first offense and it's a misdemeanor, it can be, quote, expunged, erased. And that's what he did. And that is why it wasn't found originally. And everyone thought he had no criminal history. Well, he does. Not just a criminal history, but a history deriving out of a drug habit and preying on his own family. That's what we know right now. And I want to find out from you, a veteran homicide detective, what that means to you.
Well, it's interesting that the sister, when he was first arrested, they had the impression just before the arrest for the homicides here that one of the sisters thought, well, he did it. And, there was a question within the family, and she goes out to check the car, remember? And so this is probably one of the incidences where if somebody has a drug addiction problem, we used to call it chasing the needle, remember? Where if they're, injecting heroin, every 4 to 6 hours, they're going to need that drug. And so they go to any length possible. In this case, obviously, he steals his sister's cell phone, sells it for half price, and it's probably to support that addiction process or problem that he has. But now, if we move that forward, that pre-incident behavior tells us that he is capable of criminal behavior, okay, to a point where he will take it within the sanctuary of his own personal family. And so as this case starts to unfold even further, it won't surprise me, and I'm sure it won't surprise you, if other incidences, start to surface where the prosecution may already have those interviews down somewhere, and that's going to tell us, about the other side of him, the secret life of Bryan Kohberger. But I think we're going to see incidents where people are going to say, mostly women, are going to come forward and say, look, this guy was creepy at this party, he weirded me out, et cetera, where he became possessive of women even prior to, if he is our guy, which it sounds like the DNA is telling us it is. There's a whole bunch more behavior that's going to come forward that is going to be not connected to drugs and not connected to that addiction, but more about maybe a sexual side of his personality.
More intrinsic to Kohberger himself, not necessarily about an addiction, but about his personality. Another thing regarding that, Chris McDonough, is that most of this evidence, if not all of it, will never come in front of a jury.
Yeah, and this is why I think it's fascinating that the defense is utilizing motions to start planning a narrative to the public. And this is
okay,
why
what do you mean by that?
I think, well, the gag order is in place for the court. And so now we get two new attorneys involved who, rightfully so, as part of the death penalty team for the defense. We get two new attorneys involved, and immediately they start writing, motions about the DNA evidence. And it's crafted very, very well, by lawyers who are DNA experts, both of them. But what it's doing is it's creating a narrative within the public. So, that's kind of getting around the gag order that the court has. They're utilizing the public records to create a narrative, which I think is fascinating. It's actually pretty smart.
Just thinking through everything you're saying, I'm thinking through the fact that he stole from his sister. He had a friend involved giving him a ride to sell the phone, that his father turned him in. I'm thinking about that dynamic and that family dynamic and how that's playing into what we know right now. The jury most likely will never hear that. This comes on the heels of an announcement by the state that they will seek the death penalty. That gives heightened scrutiny to everything that the state does. I'm thinking about that DNA evidence, Chris McDonough. Where it was found is so critical. For instance, if it was found on the glove that you alerted police about, you said, hey, there's a glove out here, come get it. That may be by a stranger cutting through the yard. That doesn't mean anything. But if DNA is found inside one of the victim's rooms or on the bed sheets or on the victim themselves, that would be damning. But we don't know where this other DNA came from, the other two male DNAs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is, it's the elephant in the living room for the defense team. Because, this is a huge piece of evidence with that DNA on the snap of that knife sheath. The other DNA, I think, to your point, Nancy, can be explained very easily. We have the body camera of the officers responding to the parties at the house. The narrative that potentially these girls, were social butterflies. That doesn't make them, bad individuals, right? It's college. That's what kids do. And they, this was a house that there were very attractive, girls there, and these young men would come over and visit, and they would, sometimes even leave the house and let the house, party itself. And so that other DNA is not going to be, in my opinion, very difficult to overcome because, you have so many kids going in and out of that home. However, Bryan Kohberger's DNA on that sheath underneath her body tells us, or beside her body, tells us a whole bunch about, him being in that house. That is a really high bar to overcome, but, you're the expert.
Well, hold on right there. That's another issue, and a good issue for the state. It's one thing for a friend, a study partner, a boyfriend to have their DNA in the home. But why is Kohberger's DNA in the home? He isn't rightfully there, much less on the knife sheath. And we can't claim, oh, this is the knife he looked at a store, at a knife shop, and then somebody else bought it and they're the killer. No, because of that Amazon purchase receipt. Describe that, Chris McDonough. I would say that's the fly in the ointment right there, in addition to the DNA. Explain.
No, that's a solid point, Nancy. I agree. And, it's such a low-tech piece of evidence, right, where he orders it and, it's delivered. Now there is a similar knife from Amazon connected to Bryan Kohberger, according to the reports that we're hearing. But let's go back to other low-tech information.
Wait a minute. Right? Wait. Yes, I'll go back with low-tech information. But I just want to be clear. Police have obtained an Amazon receipt showing Kohberger purchased a K-bar knife and sheath from Amazon 7 months before the murders. That's damning, because he did have a knife matching the knife found with his DNA on it. That's pretty damning. Okay, now back to low-tech info. What were you saying?
Yeah, so you would expect now the defense to produce that knife and sheath. So I think the prosecution could put them in a prisoner's dilemma, for lack of a better term. Where,
in other words, you're saying, hey, if that's not your knife that you bought on Amazon, then where is your knife?
Yeah, bring it to court, and let's put a number on it, and put it in evidence. And it won't surprise me if some knife does show up, quite frankly, with a sheath that they've purchased post-incident, just for the theater effect, which that's good lawyering. But in this situation,
also unethical to fabricate evidence. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so let's go back also to some of the other information that we have. We have the vehicle, a Hyundai Elantra that's described. It's seen on video from that neighbor's video camera the morning of the homicide. We also see it at the gas station going by. And so the police were onto him from the car, i.e. just the car description. But the low-tech piece of this is that officer at Washington State University who took the initiative to start looking for that Hyundai through all the parking records at the university. And lo and behold, they come across a Hyundai that belongs to Bryan Kohberger. And next thing you know it, they have a name. That name, very low tech, leads them to the DNA.
You're right. Can you imagine that officer? An officer, a campus officer at WSU, Washington State University, hears about, hey, they're looking for a Whitey Elantra. So Washington State is about 10 miles-ish from the murder scene. So he, on his own, just starts looking through the records, and he finds an Elantra registered to Bryan Kohberger. Because if you live on student housing, you have to register your car and a lot of other information. So he goes driving around. He hooks up with another officer. They start driving around, and lo and behold, as you said, there it is. It's sitting right there in the parking lot, right at his second floor apartment, right out in front of it. And that is where it all began. Right there. Very low tech, Chris McDonough, you're right. Then they figure out that he's about to leave for Thanksgiving break, and they follow him all the way to the Poconos. And that is where they get the dad's DNA, and that DNA matches back to the knife sheath. Then they do another DNA match. It's Kohberger, dead in the water, and the case goes on. You're right.
Yeah,
very
exactly.
low tech.
Yep. And you know, being in that, I know that feeling when you get this, you know, piece of information as a case agent, and you go, okay, well, who's this guy? Who is this guy? And, you know, let's get on this quickly. And lo and behold, you know, that chain of events started this domino effect pretty quickly, to where the surveillance, you know, the feds get involved, you know, interstate, because it's in Pennsylvania. You know, you get the state police involved back there. And, you know, you start doing interviews behind the scenes on the phone, you know, hey, we've got this Honda, you know, this white Honda Elantra out here. And, you know, we're investigating, you know, the case, blah, blah, blah. Can you tell us a little bit about your guy out there? What do you know about him? Okay. And that whole flow of information starts to come. So now then we see it's at the trial side of things, and you've had hundreds of cases, Nancy. You know, you're a brilliant attorney in the courtroom. I can only imagine, you know, watching people get eviscerated by your skill. But you know more than anybody, the last thing you want is information presented on your desk and we're missing something from the investigative side, right? You want it all. If it's good, if it's bad, just give it to me. I'll deal with it in the courtroom. And so where I'm going with this point is now we start seeing these motions start to come forward about the officers involved. And, you know, it's
Oh,
typical,
wait, yes. Let me clarify what you just said. You're right, number one. What Chris McDonough is talking about is a flurry of motions that have just been filed, questioning all sorts of information, questioning the officers who worked on the case, their histories, their training. Have they ever had a complaint? Can I ask you something, Chris McDonough? Have you ever called the cable company and said, guys, I just watched the most incredible movie on Amazon Prime, and I just want to thank you for doing such a great job as a cable carrier? Have you ever said that? Ever?
I haven't.
Okay. Whenever there's a problem, I bet you get on the horn with cable, right? I got my cables out. Yes. Fix it. Okay.
Yes.
Same thing with police officers. The only people that call in is when they say, hey, he was really rude to me, or she pulled me over for no reason, or she did that and he did this and blah, blah, blah. Maybe some of them are true. Don't know about that. But there's going to be complaints on every officer, just like every cable TV in this country goes out and somebody gets a complaint. It happens. So the defense wants every complaint, the training records, everything on every officer that worked on this case. And they want a lot more. They want the genealogical tree data. They want navigational data on the car, because that means they're going to challenge the state's navigational data and the cell phone data showing that he took that circuitous route leaving the home to get to his place the night of the murders. But you brought up the cops. Let's go with that. What does that mean to you? Why are they wanting training records of all the officers on the case, even their training records, before they were even a cop?
Well, yes, and that's character reference evidence, right? They want to impeach these officers on something if those officers take the stand to testify on the people's case. And so I think it's important for your audience to understand that when you go to the police academy, they immediately start to keep records. And there are three types of records. There's basic, intermediate, and advanced. And it's usually through an accreditation like POST, you know, in California where I did my time as in homicide. We had POST, which is the Peace Officer Standards of Training. And those records are kept by your department, and they're separate from the public's, to your point, Nancy, the public coming in and saying, hey, this officer was, unfriendly to me, and I want to file talk to a supervisor or something. And, sometimes officers get written in their record, that he was rude, et cetera, I counseled him, et cetera, which is no big deal. I mean, that happens. That's life. We make mistakes. Police make mistakes. But in the training records, those are controlled typically by, in California, the California Department of Justice. So DOJ oversees those training records. But there's a copy kept at the agency. And that just basically, tells everybody, look, I went to this school, this school, this school.
But in those training records, won't it say something like, this trainee is too aggressive, or this trainee screwed up X, Y, or Z? Why don't they just get the kindergarten records out and say, hey, when he was 3 years old, Officer White picked his nose in kindergarten. What about that? I mean, who knows what's going to be in the training records? They're really digging deep here. So that's what they're after, anything that could somehow discredit one of the cops on this case. But they're also demanding additional cell phone record data and FBI forensic reports on the white Hyundai. What are they going to do with FBI reports on the Hyundai? What's that all about? Is it about evidence found or not found in the car, or is it about the tracking system?
Well, I think it's both. And it's also, I think they're going to attack the fact that they had the wrong year initially. When, the initial reporting came out, it was a different year Hyundai than what actually, Kohberger owned.
Oh, blah, blah, blah.
Exactly. They're missing the big point. It is a Hyundai, and it is white. And it is
an Elantra, and it is his.
And it is, exactly. But you know what? You got the year wrong. You got the year wrong.
Got the year wrong. Okay. This is going to go on and on. These attacks on the state's evidence have just begun. We wait as the case unfolds. Goodbye. Thanks, Chris. Guys, thank you for watching Crime Online with Nancy Grace here on YouTube. To get the very latest, subscribe to Crime Online here